The morning I drove out to the Brennan spread for the last time, I remember thinking how the light looked different. Softer, maybe. Like the sun was apologizing for something it hadn't done yet. I'd been working summers on that ranch for going on 6 years by then, 40 miles northwest of Fredericksburg, deep in Texas hill country, where the limestone breaks through the soil like old bones, and the cedar grows so thick you can lose yourself between one fence post and the next. My name's Zephyr Duskwalker, which sounds made up, I know. My mother had notions about naming. Thought something unusual would set me apart. She was right, just not in the way she hoped. I worked as an electrician during the off-season, wiring up new construction in the suburbs, spreading like a rash around San Antonio. Good money, steady work, but it made me feel like I was suffocating. Something about the fluorescent lights and the identical houses and the way everyone talked about their lawns made my chest tight. So every May through September, I'd head up to hill country and hire on with old Brennan. The pay was about like half what I made in the city, but the air tasted like something worth breathing. Carol didn't understand it. My wife, she was my wife then, I should say. She'd grown up in Houston, thought anything more than 20 minutes from a target was practically wilderness. We'd been married 4 years, and we were happy. Mostly happy. She had a way of looking at me sometimes, like she was trying to solve a puzzle she'd lost half the pieces to. You know, she'd said that morning watching me load my truck. Jackson Electric is hiring a foreman. Benefits, retirement, things adults do. I am an adult, I'd told her. Adults are allowed to like their jobs. You like sweating and shoveling cow shit? I like seeing the sky. I'd kissed her forehead. I like coming home to you with stories that aren't about which outlet goes where. She'd smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Just think about it. That's all I'm asking. I thought about it the whole drive up. Thought about how the gap between what she wanted and what I needed seemed to widen every year, how we'd stopped fighting about it and started just going quiet, which felt worse somehow. By the time I hit the Brennan gate, I decided to have a real conversation with her when I got back. Lay it all out. Figure out a compromise. Funny the things you think matter. The Brennan spread covered about 2,000 acres of rough country, live oaks and cedar elms crowding the draws, mesquite on the high ground, and good grass in between when the rain cooperated. Earl Brennan was 73 years old and built like a fence post, all sinew and leather, with hands that could palm a basketball and a voice like gravel in a tumbler. His wife had passed 8 years back, and his kids had all moved to cities where the money was easier. He ran the place with a rotating crew of hired hands, a foreman named Miguel who'd been there longer than I had, and 3 blue heelers who thought they were in charge of everybody. Zephyr. He nodded when I pulled up to the main house, not wasting words like always. East fence needs checking. Something's been at the cattle. Mountain lion? Miguel thinks maybe. Found a calf dead 2 days back, down by the holler. You know the spot. I knew it. Everyone who worked the Brennan spread knew the holler, a deep limestone gash that cut through the eastern boundary, running maybe half a mile before it opened up onto state land. The old oaks grew so thick down there that sunlight barely touched the creek bed even at noon. The first time I'd ridden fence along its edge, I'd asked Miguel why it felt different, why the air seemed heavier. Los Viejos called it Devil's Notch, he'd said, not looking at me, The old-timers, their grandfathers, they don't say why. That's not ominous at all. He'd shrugged. Stay out of the holler. You don't have to worry about what's in it. Simple. That had been my first summer. I'd stayed out of the holler since then, not because I believed in old wives' tales, but because there was no reason to go down there. The fence line ran along the ridge above it, easy to check from horseback or truck, and cattle had better sense than to graze in a place with no good grass and too many rocks. At least, they used to have better sense. That first morning, I loaded up the old Ford Ranch truck and headed for the eastern fence with a thermos of coffee and my grandfather's 30-30 in the rack behind my head. The rifle was habit, not worry. You never knew when you might come across a snake that needed discouraging or a coyote bold enough to test you. I'd never had to fire it at anything but targets, but something about the weight of it there made me feel less alone. The drive out took 20 minutes on ranch roads that barely deserved the name. 2 ruts worn through the grass, rocks scraping the undercarriage, cedar branches reaching out to slap the side mirrors. I passed a group of cattle, bunched together in the middle pasture, which struck me as odd. Usually they spread out to graze in the morning, taking advantage of the cooler hours before the sun turned brutal. These were pressed so close together I could see the whites of their eyes, all of them facing the same direction, away from the holler. I slowed the truck, watching them. They didn't spook at the engine noise like they normally would. They were too busy being spooked by something else. I told myself mountain lion. Big cat scent would do that to prey animals, make them bunch up and keep their eyes on the tree line. Made sense. Explained everything. Except I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't explain the silence. You don't notice how much noise the world makes until it stops. Out in hill country, there's always something. Mockingbirds arguing, wrens chattering, crows complaining about everything and nothing. Cicadas in summer like a wall of sound that gets so constant, you forget it's there. Wind through the cedar making that whisper rustle that sounds like voices just too quiet to make out. That morning there was nothing. I rolled down my window and listened. Engine idle. My own breathing. That was it. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to have pulled back, leaving the cedars still and watchful. The cattle made no sound at all, which was maybe the strangest part. No lowing, no shuffling, nothing but the soft, wet rhythm of their breathing. I remember thinking, something's wrong. And then I remember thinking, don't be stupid, Zephyr. It's a quiet morning. That's all. I kept driving. The fence line looked fine for the first mile or so. Barbed wire tight, posts standing straight. No gaps where cattle could push through or predators could slip in. I made notes on the little pad I kept in my shirt pocket. Habit from 6 summers of this work. Replace tension wire in section 14. Post leaning in section 17. Normal stuff, ranch stuff. I almost missed the first carcass. It was off in the brush, maybe 30 yards from the fence, and at first I thought it was just a pile of branches. But something about the color was wrong. Too pale for cedar. Too dark for limestone. I stopped the truck and grabbed the .30-30 before I got out, not really knowing why. It was a deer. A white-tailed doe. Probably 3 or 4 years old based on her size. She'd been dead a while. Days, at least. But she hadn't been scavenged. No buzzards had touched her, no coyotes, no insects. She lay there in the morning light, and her body was arranged in a way that made my stomach flip. Her spine was bent backward. Not broken. Bent, like something had grabbed her head and tail and folded her the wrong way. Her belly was open, organs missing, but there was no blood on the ground beneath her. No blood anywhere, like she'd been cleaned before being placed here. Placed. That was the word that came to me, and I didn't like it. I crouched beside her, the .30-30 cradled in my arms, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Mountain lions didn't do this. They killed. They fed. They cached carcasses for later. They didn't arrange them. They didn't drain the blood and take only certain organs. Maybe some kids, I thought. Some sick kids from town playing at something dark. But the holler was a long way from town, and there were no tire tracks besides mine, no footprints in the dust that I could see. Nothing to indicate anyone had been here at all. I photographed the carcass with my phone, though I wasn't sure who I'd show the pictures to. Then I walked a slow circle around the area, looking for tracks, for scat, for anything that would tell me what had done this. What I found was 3 more carcasses within 100 yards, all deer, all arranged the same way, spines bent wrong, organs removed, no blood. They formed a rough line, I realized, pointing from the fence toward the edge of the holler, like markers, like signs. I stood at the last one, looking down into that dark cut in the earth, and the silence pressed against my ears like hands. The air smelled wrong, not like death, but like something older, copper and stone and something else, something that made the hindbrain prickle. I didn't go into the holler. I wasn't that stupid. But I stood there longer than I should have, staring into those shadows, and I remember thinking, something's looking back. I drove straight back to the main house and found Brennan in the barn, working on a tractor engine with Miguel. Both of them looked up when I came in, and something in my face must have shown because Brennan set down his wrench. "What'd you find?" I told them about the deer, about the way they were arranged, the missing organs, the lack of blood. Miguel crossed himself, a quick gesture, almost unconscious, and Brennan just frowned, working his jaw like he was chewing on something tough. "Cattle won't go near the holler anymore," I added. "Saw them this morning bunched up in the middle pasture, spooked." "They've been doing that for a week," Miguel said. His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. I told Mr. Brennan. "Something's got them scared." "Something like what?" "Big cat," Brennan said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Has to be. Panther come up from the south, maybe. They range pretty far." "Mountain lions don't arrange their kills in a line pointing toward where they're denning." "You don't know that's what it's doing." "Then what is it doing?" Brennan didn't answer. He picked up his wrench and went back to the tractor engine, and I understood that the conversation was over. Out here, you didn't talk about things you couldn't shoot or rope or fix with your hands. You just kept working and hoped the problem went away on its own. I spent the rest of that day helping Miguel move cattle to the western pastures away from the holler. The animals went willingly, almost eagerly, and I tried not to think about what that meant. When evening came and the light started dying, I noticed the ranch dogs. All 3 of them were on the porch of the main house, pressed against the door. They hadn't moved all day, Miguel said. Wouldn't come when called. Wouldn't eat their dinner. Just lay there, watching the eastern horizon, whining low in their throats. "They know something," Miguel said. "We were standing in the yard, the sunset painting everything gold and red. Dogs always know. My grandmother, she said the dogs can see what we can't." "What can't we see?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his face that I'd never seen before. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something like resignation. Los que caminan en la oscuridad, he said quietly. Those who walk in the darkness. The old stories say they come when the land is sick, when something's disturbed what should stay buried. You believe that? I believe the dogs are afraid. He glanced toward the holler, invisible now in the gathering dark. And I believe I'm going home before full dark. You should do the same. He left. I stayed a while longer, watching the shadows grow, listening to the silence, where there should have been crickets and night birds and all the sounds of a world winding down for sleep. There was nothing. Just the wind finally returning, whispering through the cedar. And somewhere far off, toward the holler, a sound I couldn't identify, a grinding maybe, like stone against stone or something else entirely. I told myself I'd set up a trail camera in the morning, get some evidence, find a rational explanation. I told myself a lot of things. The next morning, I was out before dawn with the trail camera I'd picked up from Brennan's equipment shed. It was an older model, one of those infrared units that hunters use for tracking deer movement. But it would do the job. At least, that's what I told myself, as I loaded it into the truck along with fresh batteries and a length of paracord to secure it to a tree. Carol had called the night before, wanting to know how the first day had gone. I'd told her about the fence work, about moving cattle, about the heat. I hadn't mentioned the deer carcasses or the silence or the dogs that wouldn't leave the porch. Some things you don't share over the phone, some things you don't know how to share at all. You sound tired, she'd said. Long day. Good tired, though. Zephyr. A pause. You're not using this as an excuse to avoid talking about our conversation this morning, are you? Which conversation? The foreman job, Jackson Electric. Benefits and retirement and adult decisions. I'd rubbed my eyes, watching the last light fade through the bunkhouse window. I'm not avoiding anything. We'll talk when I get back. Really talk, I promise. That's what you said last summer? She was right. It was what I'd said last summer and the summer before that. We kept promising to have the conversation that would fix everything, and we kept pushing it off until the distance between us grew wider than any words could bridge. I love you, I'd said. I love you too. And then, softer, I just don't know if that's enough anymore. I'd carried those words with me into sleep, and they were still there when I woke up in the gray pre-dawn, heavy as stones in my chest. But I had work to do, and work was simpler than feelings. Work was problems you could solve with your hands. The drive out to the eastern fence line felt different in the half-light before sunrise. Shadows stretched long and thin across the grass, and the world had that hushed quality it gets when everything's holding its breath, waiting for the sun to give permission to start the day. I kept the radio off. Usually I'd have some old country station playing, Waylon or Willie or Merle. But this morning I wanted to listen. Needed to listen. The silence was still there. I'd hoped it wouldn't be. I'd hoped that yesterday had been some fluke, some atmospheric phenomenon that made sound travel wrong. But as I rolled down my window and let the morning air fill the cab, I heard nothing but the engine and my own heartbeat. No birds, no insects, not even wind. I set up the trail camera at the mouth of the holler, strapping it to an old live oak that grew right at the edge where the land dropped away into shadow. The tree's bark was rough under my hands, and I noticed something strange about it as I worked. A pattern of scratches running up the trunk, higher than I could reach. Claw marks, maybe, but too wide apart for any cat and too regular. Almost deliberate. I didn't let myself think about that. I just made sure the camera was secure, checked the battery indicator, and pointed the lens into the hauler's darkness. "All right," I said out loud, just to hear something. "Let's see what's down there." My voice sounded thin and small, swallowed by the silence before the echo could even start. I spent the rest of that morning riding the fence line with Miguel, checking for gaps or damage. But I couldn't focus on the work. My eyes kept drifting east toward the hauler, toward the tree line, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been, even with the sun climbing higher. Miguel noticed. Of course he noticed. The man missed nothing, but he didn't say anything until we stopped for lunch in the shade of a mesquite, sharing cold burritos his wife had packed. "You set up a camera," he said. Not a question. "Yeah. Down by the holler." "You shouldn't have done that." I looked at him, waiting for more, but he just chewed his burrito and stared at the horizon. After a minute, I asked, "Why not?" "Because now you're looking for something. And when you look for something," he shook his head. "There's a reason my grandmother told stories about doors you shouldn't open. Attention is a door, Zephyr. You're opening it." "Your grandmother sounds like she had a lot of stories." "She grew up in Oaxaca, the old country, the real old country. The mountains there remember things our mountains have forgotten. She used to say that some creatures don't exist until you notice them. And once you notice them," he crossed himself again, that quick unconscious gesture, "they notice you back." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him that was superstitious nonsense, that we lived in a world of trail cameras and game wardens and rational explanations for everything. But the words wouldn't come because somewhere underneath my skepticism was a cold, hard knot of fear that knew he was right. "It's probably just a mountain lion," I said instead. "A big one denning in the holler, picking off deer. Game warden can deal with it." Miguel didn't answer. He just finished his burrito, balled up the foil, and went back to work. That afternoon, I drove into Fredericksburg and found the game warden's office tucked behind the courthouse. The warden was a stocky woman named Patterson with a permanent squint and hands that looked like they'd wrangled more wildlife than most people ever saw. She listened to my story about the deer carcasses, her expression shifting from bored to interested to something I couldn't quite read. "Arranged how?" she asked. "Spines bent backward like they'd been folded. Organs removed, no blood." "No blood at all?" "Not that I could see." "And they were in a line pointing toward this holler that cuts through the property." Patterson leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming on her desk. "That's unusual." "That's what I thought." "Could be a big cat, I suppose." "We get panthers through here sometimes, though they're rare. But the arrangement thing, the blood thing." She shook her head. "That doesn't fit any predator behavior I know." "So what do you think it is?" "I think I need to come out and take a look. But I'm slammed this week. Got a hog problem over near Kerrville that's eating my time. Can you leave those carcasses where they are?" "They're not going anywhere." She gave me a look that I couldn't quite interpret. "Call me if you find more." "And Mr. Duskwalker?" She paused, and something in her eyes told me she'd heard stories too. "Be careful out there. Hill country's got some strange corners." I drove back to the ranch with the afternoon sun slanting through my windshield, thinking about strange corners and strange stories and the way Miguel crossed himself every time someone mentioned the holler. I thought about Carol too, about the distance in her voice, about the way she'd said she didn't know if love was enough anymore. I thought about all the years I'd spent running from things I didn't want to face, telling myself that next summer I'd deal with it, next year I'd have the hard conversations. Maybe that's why I didn't leave when I should have. Maybe I was too used to ignoring warning signs. The trail camera was where I'd left it, still strapped to the old oak at the holler's mouth. I checked the battery indicator, still full, and noted the timestamp on the small display. It had been recording for about 8 hours. Plenty of time to catch whatever had been moving through this area, leaving dead deer behind like calling cards. I pulled the memory card and took it back to the bunkhouse where I had a laptop I used for invoices and email. The video files loaded slowly, each one a 3-minute segment of infrared footage showing the holler's entrance in that ghostly green-gray that night vision cameras produce. The first few hours showed nothing, just the dark mouth of the holler, the creek bed barely visible, the trees standing motionless in the windless night. I fast-forwarded, watching the timestamp jump. 10 p.m., 11 p.m., midnight. Then the first gap. The video jumped from 12:17 a.m. to 12:43 a.m. 26 minutes missing, no footage at all, just a clean cut between one moment and the next. The battery indicator in the corner showed full charge the whole time. The camera hadn't died. It had just stopped. I scrolled forward. Another gap from 2 to 2:31 a.m., another from 4:15 to 4:47 a.m., 3 gaps total, adding up to almost an hour and a half of missing footage, and in between them, nothing but empty darkness and the unchanging mouth of the holler. I watched the whole thing twice, looking for any sign of movement, any explanation for why the camera would stop recording. I found nothing. The gaps were clean, inexplicable, like something had reached out and pressed pause on reality. I told myself it was a malfunction. Old camera, old batteries, probably some technical glitch I didn't understand. I told myself I'd set up a second camera tomorrow, catch whatever was wrong with the first one. I told myself a lot of things that week. The dogs got worse. By the third day, they wouldn't eat at all, just huddled against the main house door and whined whenever anyone came near. Brennan tried to coax them out, tried dragging them to their food bowls, but they fought him with a desperation that bordered on feral. One of them, the oldest, a bitch named Sadie who'd been on the ranch longer than I had, actually snapped at him when he tried to pick her up, something she'd never done in all her years. "Something's wrong with them," Brennan said, and for the first time I heard uncertainty in his voice. Might need to call the vet. But we both knew the vet wouldn't find anything. There was nothing wrong with the dogs, not in any way that medicine could fix. They were afraid of something we couldn't see, and they were showing the only warning they knew how to give. The cattle stayed bunched in the western pastures, refusing to graze anywhere near the holler. We'd lost 2 calves by the 4th day. Not to predators, but to stress. They'd just stopped eating and drinking, huddled against their mothers, and died. The vet came for those at least, and left shaking his head, muttering about cattle sometimes doing inexplicable things during drought years, even when there wasn't a drought. Something in the air, he'd said, something they can sense that we can't. Happens sometimes. But it didn't happen sometimes, not like this. Not with dogs and cattle and the land itself all screaming a warning that nobody wanted to hear. I set up a second trail camera. This one motion activated and brand new, purchased from a sporting goods store in town. I checked the old camera's footage every day, and every day there were more gaps. Longer ones now, sometimes 2 or 3 hours of nothing, and the gaps always came after midnight. Whatever was moving through that area knew how to avoid being seen, or it knew how to make itself not be there when the camera was looking. That thought should have seemed crazy. It didn't anymore. By the 5th day, I'd started sleeping with my grandfather's .30-30 beside my bunk. I'd never done that before, not once in 6 summers on the ranch. The bunkhouse had always felt safe, a solid little building with thick walls and good locks. But now it felt exposed, vulnerable, like the darkness outside was pressing against the windows, looking for a way in. I remember lying awake that night, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silence anymore. And there was something underneath it now. A pressure, a presence, a sense of being watched by something that didn't need eyes to see. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the stress was getting to me, the lack of sleep, the tension with Carol, all of it piling up until my brain started manufacturing threats that weren't there. Then I heard it, grinding, low and rhythmic, like stone against stone, coming from somewhere outside, from the direction of the holler. I grabbed the rifle and went to the window, heart hammering against my ribs. The night was clear, full moon painting the landscape in silver and shadow, and I could see the fence line running east toward the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed wrong. But the grinding continued, rising and falling in a pattern that almost sounded like breathing. I stood at that window for what felt like hours, watching, waiting. The rifle stock slick with sweat from my palms. The sound faded eventually, dying away as the moon crossed the sky, and by the time it was gone, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely set the gun down. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I just sat on my bunk with my back against the wall, watching the windows turn gray with dawn, and tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. The 6th night I saw the eyes. I'd been checking the fence line along the holler's edge, something I'd been doing every evening despite Miguel's warnings, despite my own growing dread. I told myself it was duty. I was being paid to maintain the property, and that meant making sure nothing had damaged the wire during the day. But really, I was looking. I was searching for evidence, for proof, for something that would let me understand what was happening to this place. The sun was just touching the western horizon when I finished my sweep, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I'd been able to appreciate them. I was standing at the edge of the holler, looking down into those shadows, when I realized the silence had changed. It wasn't just the absence of sound anymore. It was a presence, a thick, heavy nothing that pressed against my eardrums like water. I could feel it in my chest, could feel my heart stuttering against the weight of it. And there was a smell now, too. Copper and something else. Something organic and wrong, drifting up from the holler's depths. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back to the truck, to drive away, to not look down into those shadows for one more second. But I was frozen, my boots rooted to the limestone, my eyes fixed on the darkness below. That's when I saw them. 3 points of light, amber gold, arranged in a perfect triangle. They blinked once, slowly, and then they moved. They rose. I watched them climb, those 3 lights, watched them rise up through the shadows until they were level with where I stood on the rim. 8 feet up at least, maybe 9. Far too high for a cat, for a dog, for a bear that didn't exist in this part of Texas anyway. And then they focused on me, I can't describe what that felt like, being seen by something that shouldn't exist. It was like having cold water poured directly into my spine, like every primitive warning system in my body going off at once. My vision tunneled. My breath stopped. My hands, still holding the point 30-30, went numb and stupid. Those eyes didn't blink again. They just watched, studied, measured, and then slowly they began to move. Sideways, along the holler's edge, tracking me. Not approaching, not yet. Just observing. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, maybe, or hours. Time didn't seem to work right with those eyes fixed on me. But eventually something broke. Some barrier between terror and action, and I ran. I ran to the truck, yanked open the door, threw the rifle inside, and drove. I didn't look in the rear-view mirror. I didn't slow down until I hit the main ranch road, and even then I was doing 60 over ground that shouldn't have handled more than 30. The truck bounced and slammed over ruts, and I didn't care. I just needed distance between me and those eyes. When I finally stopped, a mile from the main house, I was shaking so badly, I couldn't hold the steering wheel steady. My breath came in gasps, each one burning my throat, and there were tears on my face that I didn't remember crying. 3 eyes, I thought. 3 eyes in a triangle. What is 3 eyes? Nothing. Nothing in any field guide, any nature documentary, any rational explanation I could construct. Nothing I'd ever heard of had 3 eyes arranged like that, glowing amber gold in the darkness. I told myself I'd imagined it, told myself it was a trick of the light, moonlight reflecting off something natural, a cluster of rocks maybe, or the eyes of 3 separate animals that just happened to be positioned close together. I built an explanation out of denial and desperation, and I repeated it to myself the whole drive back to the bunkhouse. By the time I got inside and locked the door behind me, I'd almost convinced myself to believe it. Almost. That night I dreamed of the holler. I dreamed I was standing at its edge again, but this time the sun was gone and the moon was gone, and there was nothing but those 3 amber eyes rising up from the darkness. They rose and rose, higher than any animal could stand, and as they rose, the shape beneath them began to take form. Shoulders too broad, spine curved wrong, legs that bent backward at the knee. I woke up gasping, soaked in sweat, my hand already reaching for the rifle. It was 3 a.m. The bunkhouse was dark and quiet, but beyond the windows, I could hear that grinding sound again. Closer now. Right outside, maybe. I didn't look. I just lay there in the dark, clutching my grandfather's rifle, and waited for dawn. The 7th day, I saw the silhouette. I'd spent the whole day trying to act normal, trying to pretend that the previous night hadn't happened. I helped Miguel move cattle. I fixed a broken gate on the western pasture. I ate dinner with Brennan and made small talk about the weather, about the price of beef, about nothing that mattered. If either of them noticed something wrong with me, they didn't say so. But as the sun started to set, I found myself drifting east again. Not toward the holler, I wasn't that stupid, but toward a ridge that ran parallel to it, high ground where I could see for miles in every direction. I told myself I just wanted to watch the sunset. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything, lies we tell ourselves to keep moving forward. The sunset was beautiful that night, all crimson and gold, bleeding into purple, and the full moon was already rising in the east like a second sun. I sat on a limestone outcropping and watched the colors shift, watched the shadows grow long and then longer, and for a little while, I almost felt peaceful. Almost forgot the fear that had been living in my chest for a week. Then I saw it. It was on the ridge, above the holler, maybe a quarter-mile away, moving along the tree line. At first I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the dying light, an optical illusion created by branches and leaves. But shadows don't move like that. Shadows don't have shoulders and arms and a head that swivels slowly to track your position. I raised the rifle instinctively, though I knew the distance was too far for a clean shot. Through the scope, I could make out the shape more clearly. It was big. So much bigger than I'd imagined from just the eyes. 7 feet tall at least, maybe more, and that was with it hunched over, spine curved forward like a question mark. Its shoulders were too broad for its frame, and its arms hung too long, almost brushing the ground as it walked. The legs, God, the legs. They bent the wrong way, backward at the knee like a dog's hind legs, but it walked upright. It walked on 2 feet, each step deliberate and slow. Through the scope, I could see it turn its head toward me. See those 3 eyes catch the light of the setting sun and flash amber gold. It saw me seeing it. We watched each other across that distance for what might have been a minute or an hour. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just kept the rifle scope pressed to my eye, watching that impossible shape, waiting for it to charge or flee or do something that made sense. It did neither. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one of those 2 long arms. Through the scope, I could see fingers, too many fingers with too many joints, each one ending in a curved talon that gleamed like wet bone. It raised that hand and it pointed at me. Then it dropped back down to all 4s and loped away into the holler, disappearing into shadow so quickly it might never have been there at all. I don't remember driving back to the bunkhouse. I don't remember locking the door or wedging a chair under the handle or pushing my bunk against the wall. I remember shaking. I remember the taste of bile in my throat. I remember saying, "It's not real, it's not real, it's not real," over and over again, like a prayer, that I didn't believe anymore, because it was real. Whatever I'd seen on that ridge, whatever was living in the holler, it was real. It was real, and it knew I was here, and it had pointed at me with fingers that shouldn't exist, claimed me somehow, marked me. I called Carol that night. It was late, past midnight, and she answered on the 4th ring with sleep in her voice. "Zephyr? What's wrong?" Everything. Everything is wrong, and I don't know how to explain it, and you're never going to believe me if I try. Nothing, I wanted to hear your voice. A pause, a sigh. It's after midnight. I know, I'm sorry, I had a bad day and I wanted to tell you I love you. Another pause, longer this time. Are you okay? You sound scared. I'm fine, just tired. Long days out here. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Could feel her trying to decide whether to push or let it go. Carol had always been able to read me, even when I didn't want her to. It was one of the things I loved about her, and one of the things that made lying to her so hard. "Zephyr, if something's wrong, you can tell me." You know that, right? Whatever it is, you can tell me. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. I wanted to say I saw something in the holler, and it's not an animal and it's not human, and I don't know what it is, but it pointed at me, Carol. It pointed at me like it was choosing me, and I'm so scared I can barely breathe. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because saying it out loud would make it real. And I wasn't ready for it to be real yet. I was still clinging to the hope that I'd wake up tomorrow and none of this would have happened. That the deer carcasses and the silence and the eyes would all just be some fever dream I could shake off, with enough coffee and denial. "I'm fine," I said. "Really, I love you." "I love you too." But there was distance in her voice now, that familiar tone that meant she knew I was hiding something and didn't know how to reach me. "Come home soon, okay? We need to talk. Really talk this time." "I will, I promise." I hung up and sat in the dark, listening to the silence outside. The grinding sound was back, distant but present, a rhythm that rose and fell like breathing. I pressed my hands to my face and tried to convince myself that I was losing my mind, that stress and sleep deprivation and marital tension were combining into some kind of psychotic break. It didn't work. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what was out there, and somewhere, in the darkest part of my mind, I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. The thing about fear is that it doesn't stay pure. It can't. The human mind isn't built to sustain that level of terror indefinitely, so it starts to mix with other things: anger, denial, desperate rationalization. By the 8th morning, I'd cycled through all of them and come out the other side into something that felt almost like calm. I was going to figure this out. I was going to find an explanation, a real one, a natural one, and then I was going to deal with it. That's what adults did. That's what I did. I checked the trail cameras that morning and found more gaps, more missing footage. But I also found something else. A single frame caught between two gaps, showing a shape at the holler's edge. Blurry, out of focus, probably a malfunction in the camera's infrared sensor, but if you squinted, if you looked at it just right, you could see the outline of shoulders too broad, a head that wasn't quite right, 3 points of light where the eyes would be. I stared at that frame for a long time. Then I saved it to my phone and deleted the original. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I wanted evidence that wouldn't disappear. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. Maybe I was already crazy, and saving one blurry picture wasn't going to change that. I drove into town that afternoon to see Warden Patterson. She was still busy with the hog problem, her assistant said, but she'd looked at the photos I'd sent of the deer carcasses. She'd try to come out to the ranch next week. Next week felt like a lifetime away. On the drive back, I stopped at a small church on the outskirts of Fredericksburg, a white clapboard building with a steeple that needed painting, the kind of place my grandmother would have called modest but sincere. I hadn't been to church in years, not since my mother's funeral. And I didn't really believe anymore, but something made me pull into the empty parking lot. Something made me walk up those steps and try the door. It was unlocked. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of old wood and older hymnals. I sat in a pew near the back and stared at the cross on the wall, trying to remember how prayer worked. "Can I help you?" I turned. A man in clergy collar stood in the doorway of a side room, white-haired and weathered, with eyes that looked like they'd seen more than they wanted to remember. "I don't know," I said honestly. I'm not sure why I'm here." He walked over and sat down in the pew in front of me, turning to face me with a patient expression. "That's usually a good reason to be here. People who know exactly what they're looking for rarely need help finding it." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you believe in things that shouldn't exist? Things outside of normal, I mean? Things that don't fit into any explanation?" The pastor, I never did get his name, studied me for a long moment. "I believe that creation is vast beyond our understanding. I believe that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy, as the bard said. And I believe that some of those things are beautiful and some are terrible, and most are both. What about the terrible ones? What do you do when you encounter something terrible? He didn't answer right away. He turned and looked at the cross, his expression thoughtful and sad. You pray, he said finally, and you run. Sometimes you have to do both at the same time. I thanked him and left, not feeling better exactly, but feeling something. Acknowledged, maybe. Like someone else had seen the shape of the thing I was afraid of, even if he couldn't name it either. That night, I didn't go back to the bunkhouse. I slept in my truck in the main ranch yard, doors locked, windows up, engine running with the AC on. It felt stupid. It felt childish. It felt like the smartest thing I'd done all week. Through the windshield, I watched the moon rise over the eastern hills, watched the shadows stretch toward the holler, watched and waited for something I couldn't name to make its next move. And somewhere out in the darkness, the grinding sound continued. Closer now, so much closer than before. I knew I should leave, pack up my truck and head back to San Antonio, tell Brennan I was sorry, but something had come up. It would be easy. It would be the smart thing to do. But something kept me there. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. The same part of me that had spent 6 summers running from conversations with my wife because I didn't know how to have them. The part that thought problems would solve themselves if you just refused to look at them long enough. That part was going to get me killed. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out exactly how wrong I'd been about everything. The eyes I'd seen were just the beginning. The silhouette on the ridge was a warning I'd ignored. What came next would make me wish I'd listened to Miguel from the start. You don't open doors you can't close. You don't look for things that don't want to be found. And you never ever let something know you've noticed it, because once it knows you're watching, it starts watching back. The morning came gray and reluctant, like the sun itself didn't want to look at what was happening on the Brennan spread. I woke in my truck with a crick in my neck and a taste in my mouth, like I'd been chewing copper pennies. The engine had died sometime in the night, out of gas. The gauge informed me with mechanical indifference. I didn't remember the tank being that low. I sat there for a long time watching the ranch house, watching the barn, watching the tree line where the holler waited with its dark mouth open. Nothing moved, not even the wind. When I finally worked up the courage to open my door, the silence hit me like a physical weight. No cattle lowing, no horses nickering, no dogs barking, just that absolute, crushing quiet that had become the new normal on this cursed piece of land. I walked to the bunkhouse on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. My boots crunched on gravel that seemed too loud, each footstep an announcement of my presence to anything that might be listening. The door to the bunkhouse stood open. I knew I'd closed it. I always closed it. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. My duffel bag sat on the bed where I'd left it. My spare boots stood by the door. The coffee maker on the counter still held yesterday's cold dregs. But something was wrong. Something was off in a way I couldn't immediately identify. Then I saw it. My grandfather's point, 30-30, the one I'd been carrying on every fence check for the past week, lay on the small table by the window. I'd left it in my truck. I knew I'd left it in my truck because I'd fallen asleep with my hand on the stock, drawing whatever comfort I could from the cold metal and the memory of the man who'd taught me to shoot. But there it was, on the table, the barrel pointed directly at the bed where I slept, and next to it, arranged in a neat row, were all 7 cartridges I'd had loaded in the magazine. My hands were shaking as I picked up the rifle. The action was open, empty. Something, had come into my space while I slept, taken my weapon and left it here as a message, a reminder that whatever I thought might protect me, it could take away whenever it wanted. I found Brennan in the ranch house kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee, like it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. He looked up when I came in, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Fear, maybe, or recognition. "Cattle are gone," he said, his voice flat. "All of them. 63 head just vanished overnight. Not a track, not a fence down, not a goddamn thing to show where they went." I sat down across from him, my grandfather's rifle across my knees. "We need to talk, Brennan. Really talk this time." He stared at me for a long moment, then sighed and set down his coffee cup. "You saw it, didn't you? The thing in the holler." "I saw something. I don't know what it was." "My grandfather knew," Brennan said quietly. "That's why he called it the Devil's Notch. Not because of superstition, because something lived there. Something that was old when the first settlers came to this valley, something that sleeps mostly. But every few decades, it wakes up hungry. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought it was just stories." He laughed bitterly. I thought my grandfather was a superstitious old fool who believed in fairy tales. But he wasn't, was he? He knew. He knew, and he tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. "What is it? The thing in the holler. What is it?" Brennan shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Nobody knows. The Comanche who lived here before us, they had stories about it. The Spanish missionaries who came through in the 1700s, they wrote about something in these hills that wasn't natural. My grandfather found those writings in an old church archive in San Antonio. He showed them to me when I was young, tried to make me understand. I thought it was all nonsense." "What did the writings say?" "That it was old. Older than the hills, older than the rivers, maybe older than man. That it slept in the deep places, in the caves and hollows where sunlight never reached. And that when it woke, it took payment for being disturbed. Cattle, horses, sometimes people." He met my eyes. "The last time it woke was 1947. My grandfather was young then, just taken over the ranch from his father. He lost 15 head of cattle in one night, and his brother disappeared walking the fence line and was never found. Just gone. I thought about the deer carcasses, the missing cattle, the silence of the birds, and the fear of the dogs. It's awake now." "Yeah." Brennan's voice was barely a whisper. "It's awake now. And I don't know how to put it back to sleep." I spent the rest of that day trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. "Mountain lion," I told myself again. Maybe a pack of them driven down from the higher country by drought. Maybe rabies, something that made normal predators behave in abnormal ways. Maybe some kind of chemical contamination from the old mines in the area, something that affected animal behavior and caused mass hysteria. I knew I was lying to myself, but the lies were easier than the truth. Around noon, I drove into town to talk to Warden Patterson again. Her office was in a strip mall between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, and when I walked in, she looked at me like she'd been expecting me. "More dead deer?" she asked. 63 head of cattle, vanished overnight." She leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. "Zephyr, I'm going to tell you something I don't tell most people. Something that stays in this room, you understand? I nodded. I've been game warden in this county for 23 years. In that time, I've seen things I can't explain. Tracks that don't match any animal in any database. Kill patterns that don't follow any predator behavior I've ever studied. Disappearances of livestock and wildlife that defy logical explanation. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And every single time, those things happen near the same place. That holler on the Brennan property. What do you think it is? I don't think anything. Thinking implies I'm willing to accept what the evidence suggests, and I'm not. I've got a husband and 2 kids and a retirement plan, and none of those things are compatible with believing in monsters. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot. What I will tell you is this. Every time something happens near that holler, it stops eventually. A few weeks, maybe a month. Things go quiet. Animals come back. Life goes on. So my advice to you is the same advice I gave Brennan's father 30 years ago, and the same advice I gave Brennan when he took over the ranch. What's that? Stay away from the holler. Don't go near it, don't look at it, don't think about it, and wait. Whatever's happening, it'll stop. It always stops. And if it doesn't? She didn't answer. She just kept staring out the window, and after a while, I left. That night, I didn't sleep in my truck or in the bunkhouse. I drove to a motel in Fredericksburg, 40 miles from the ranch, and paid for a room with blackout curtains and a deadbolt on the door. I lay on the bed with every light on, my grandfather's rifle loaded and ready, and stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. Around 2 a.m., my phone rang. It was Brennan. "It's in the barn," he said, his voice shaking. "Zephyr, it's in the goddamn barn, and I can hear it moving around, and the horses are screaming, and I don't know what to do." "Call 911. I did. They said they'd send a deputy, but it might be an hour. "An hour, Zephyr. I don't have an hour." I was already pulling on my boots. "I'm coming. Stay in the house. Lock all the doors. Don't go outside for any reason. The horses. Forget the horses, you hear me? Forget them. Stay inside." I drove faster than I'd ever driven in my life, pushing my truck to speeds that should have killed me on those winding country roads. The whole way, I kept my phone on speaker, listening to Brennan's breathing, listening to the sounds in the background, the screaming horses, the crash of something heavy being thrown against walls, and underneath it all, that grinding sound, stone against stone, getting louder. When I pulled into the ranch yard, the barn was dark. The screaming had stopped. For a moment, I let myself hope that whatever had been in there was gone, that it had taken what it wanted and disappeared back into the holler. Then I saw Brennan standing in the doorway of the ranch house, his face white as bone, pointing at something behind me. I turned. The barn doors hung open, splintered like something had forced its way out from the inside. And in the moonlight, standing between me and the barn, was a shape I will never forget as long as I live. It was wrong. That's the only word for it. Wrong in every way a thing can be wrong. The silhouette I'd seen on the ridge had given me some idea of its size, but seeing it up close was different. It stood maybe 7 feet tall, but hunched over, curved in on itself like a man trying to protect his stomach from a blow. Its shoulders were too broad, too angular, the bones jutting at angles that spoke of a skeleton designed by something that had never seen a living creature and was working from a flawed description. And the head. God, the head. It was lupine, sort of. wolf-like in the way that a child's drawing of a wolf is wolf-like. The general shape was there, but the proportions were all wrong. The snout was too long, stretching forward almost a foot from the face, and it was filled with teeth. So many teeth. They overlapped and crowded each other, some pointing up, some pointing down, some jutting sideways at angles that couldn't possibly be functional for eating. They looked like they were designed for one thing only, causing pain. The creature took a step toward me, and I saw its hands. They weren't paws. They weren't claws. They were hands, like a man's hands, but the fingers were too long and had too many joints. 4 joints per finger, maybe 5, bending and flexing in ways that made my stomach lurch. The skin on those hands was visible through patches of fur, burnt-looking, leathery, like something that had been held in a fire and hadn't quite died. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so primal it bypassed my conscious mind entirely and spoke directly to some ancient part of my brain that remembered when things like this hunted our ancestors across primordial savannas. It tilted its head, that horrible, elongated head, and I saw the third eye. Miguel had said eyes, plural. I'd assumed he meant 2, like any normal creature, but there, in the center of the thing's forehead, was a third eye. Amber gold like the others, but larger, and it moved independently, swiveling to focus on me while the other 2 stayed fixed on something behind me. Brennan, probably. It was watching both of us at once. A sound came from its throat. Not the grinding I'd heard before, that seemed to come from inside it, from somewhere deeper than its vocal cords. This was something else. Something that might have been a voice once, or might have been trying to imitate one. It was saying my name. Not clearly. Not the way a person would say it. It was like listening to a recording played backward and slowed down. The syllables stretched and distorted until they barely resembled human speech, but I heard it. Zephyr. My name. Whispered in a voice that had no business knowing it. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds, maybe. Minutes. Time had stopped, making sense, but eventually something broke the spell. A door slamming. Brennan shouting something I couldn't understand. And the creature turned. Just turned. That was all. It didn't attack, didn't threaten, didn't do anything but turn away from me and walk toward the holler, with a gait that made my skin crawl. Its legs bent the wrong way, backward at the knee, like a dog's hind legs. But it moved with a horrible fluid grace, covering ground faster than it should have been able to. I watched it go until it disappeared into the tree line, and then I fell to my knees and vomited in the dirt, shaking so hard I thought my bones might break. Brennan was next to me a moment later, pulling me up, dragging me toward the house. Inside, he kept saying. Inside, inside. We need to get inside. We made it to the house, and he slammed the door and locked it, for all the good that would do against something that could tear through barn walls like tissue paper. I collapsed on his couch and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd just seen. It knew my name, I heard myself say. It said my name. Brennan didn't respond. He was moving through the house, checking locks, drawing curtains, doing all the useless things people do when they're trying to convince themselves they have some control over a situation that is completely beyond their control. How? I asked. How did it know my name? I don't know. His voice was hollow. I don't know anything anymore. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the night, waiting for the grinding sound to come again. But there was nothing. Just silence, complete and absolute, like the world itself was holding its breath. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the curtains and Brennan was shaking me awake. "The deputy's here," he said. "We need to show him the barn." I got up and followed him outside, squinting against the morning light. The deputy was young, maybe 25, with the eager expression of someone who hadn't yet learned that there were things in this world that couldn't be explained by training and procedure. The barn was a ruin. The doors were gone entirely, ripped from their hinges and thrown 20 feet into the yard. The walls were scored with long gouges, like something had been dragging its claws across the wood. Inside, the horses were dead. All 3 of them arranged in a neat row, their spines bent backward just like the deer I'd found weeks ago. I looked around for the dogs, Sadie and the other 2 healers, but there was no sign of them. Maybe they'd finally broken and run when the creature came, or maybe Brennan had taken them when he fled to the house. I never did find out what happened to them. Just another loose thread in a story full of them. "Jesus Christ," the deputy whispered. "What the hell did this?" "Mountain lion," Brennan said, his voice flat. The deputy stared at him. "A mountain lion did this? To 3 horses? And bent their spines backward?" "Mountain lion," Brennan repeated. "That's what happened. That's what you're going to write in your report." Something passed between them, some understanding I wasn't privy to. The deputy's eager expression faded, replaced by something older and wearier. He nodded slowly. "Mountain lion," he agreed. "I'll put in a request for wildlife services to come out, do some tracking." He paused. "You might want to consider staying somewhere else for a while, until we get this situation under control." After he left, I turned to Brennan. He knows. Of course he knows. Everyone around here knows, even if they won't admit it. But what are they going to do? Put an APB out on a monster? Send in the National Guard to hunt something that's been here longer than this country has existed? He shook his head. "No. The only thing they can do is pretend it's not happening and wait for it to go away. And if it doesn't go away, then people disappear. Livestock dies. And everyone keeps pretending until it goes back to sleep." He looked at me with hollow eyes. "That's how it's always worked. That's how it'll always work." I thought about leaving. I should have left. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get in my truck and drive until I hit the ocean, to put as many miles as possible between me and the Devil's Notch and the thing that lived there. But something kept me there. The stubbornness that had defined my whole life. The same quality that made me a good electrician but a lousy husband. I couldn't walk away from a problem without solving it. I couldn't admit defeat, not even when defeat was the only rational choice. And somewhere beneath that stubbornness was something darker. The need to prove that I wasn't prey, that I was more than just another creature for the hauler to consume. I called Carol that night. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed to hear a familiar voice, something to remind me that the normal world still existed somewhere out there. "Zephyr?" She sounded surprised. We hadn't talked in almost 2 weeks, since our last fight about me coming back early. "Is everything okay?" "No," I said honestly. "Everything is not okay." "What happened?" I tried to tell her. I really did. But how do you explain something like this to someone who hasn't seen it? How do you describe a creature that defies description, a terror that bypasses language and speaks directly to the primal fear centers of the brain? There's something wrong out here, I said finally. Something I can't explain, something bad. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Zephyr, you're scaring me. I'm scaring myself. Come home. Whatever's going on, just come home. We can figure it out together. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But even then, some part of me knew that leaving wouldn't solve anything. The thing in the holler knew my name. It had looked at me with those 3 amber gold eyes, and it had recognized me. Whatever this was, wherever I went, I had a terrible feeling it would follow. I can't, I said, not yet. There's something I need to do first. What? What could possibly be so important that I love you, Carol? I don't say it enough, but I do. Whatever happens, I need you to know that. She was crying when I hung up. I could hear it in her voice. That particular quality of tears barely held back. I'd made her cry a lot over the years, with my silences and my absences and my refusal to deal with anything directly. But this was different. This wasn't me running away from our problems. This was me trying to protect her from something she couldn't possibly understand. That night, I made a decision. I was going to find out what this thing was. I was going to understand it, if such a thing was possible. And then I was going to figure out how to stop it. Looking back, I can see how stupid that was. How arrogant. I was an electrician who worked summers as a ranch hand, facing something that had existed for centuries, maybe millennia. Something that had taken cattle and horses and people and had never once been stopped by human effort. But I didn't know any better. I thought that understanding meant power. I thought that if I could just learn enough, I could find a weakness, an exploit, a way to drive this thing back into whatever deep place it had crawled out of. I was wrong, but I wouldn't learn that for a while yet. I started my research the next morning, drove into town and spent hours at the public library pulling up every book and article I could find about the history of the region. The Comanche had lived here for centuries before the Europeans came, and their legends were full of creatures that lived in the hills and hollows, shapeshifters, skinwalkers, things that wore the faces of men but were not men. The Spanish missionaries had written about similar beings. Demonios de las montañas, they called them. Mountain demons. They described creatures that walked like men but had the heads of wolves, that could not be killed by normal means, that craved human flesh and human fear in equal measure. And there were more recent accounts, too. Newspaper clippings from the 1800s about mysterious disappearances in the hill country. A diary from a settler woman in 1872 who wrote about a wolf that walked upright outside her cabin door. A police report from 1923 about a rancher who was found with his spine bent backward, his organs missing. No blood at the scene. It was all there, if you knew where to look. Centuries of encounters, centuries of death and terror and mystery, all centered on this one spot. The holler, the Devil's Notch. But nowhere, not in any account, not in any legend, did I find anything about how to stop it. The best anyone had managed was to wait it out. The creature woke, it fed, it went back to sleep. That was the pattern. That was the cycle. I wasn't willing to accept that. That afternoon, I went back to the church where I'd spoken to the pastor. He was there again, or still there, sitting in the same pew and staring at the same cross. "You came back," he said without turning around. "I need help." He nodded slowly. "I thought you might. Sit down." I sat. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "I've been thinking about your question, about the terrible things and what we do when we encounter them. Have you come up with an answer?" "Not a good one." He turned to face me, and I saw that he looked older than before, more tired. There are prayers for protection, of course, rituals and rites that have been passed down through centuries of faith. But I'm not sure they're designed for something like what you're facing. How do you know what I'm facing? He smiled, but there was no joy in it. Because you're not the first person to come to me with this look in their eyes, and you won't be the last. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver cross on a chain. "This won't protect you, not really. But it might remind you that there is light in the world, even in the darkest places. And sometimes that reminder is enough to keep a person from losing themselves entirely." I took the cross. It was cold in my palm, colder than it should have been for something that had been in a warm pocket. "What happened to the others?" I asked. "The ones who came to you before?" He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me everything. I left the church with the cross around my neck and a growing certainty that I was in over my head. But still I couldn't leave. Still something kept me there, rooted to this place and this moment and this impossible situation. That night I went back to the ranch. Brennan had cleared out. Left a note on the kitchen table saying he was staying with his sister in Austin until things settled down. The house was empty, the barn was a ruin, and I was alone on 2,000 acres of hill country with something in the holler that knew my name. I should have been terrified. And I was in some distant part of my mind that still understood fear as a concept. But mostly I felt something else. Determination, maybe, or resignation. The sense that whatever was going to happen would happen, and the only thing I could control was how I faced it. I set up in the ranch house that night, locked all the doors and windows, checked my grandfather's rifle 3 times to make sure it was loaded, put the silver cross around my neck, and, for the first time in years, tried to remember how to pray. The grinding sound started around midnight. It came from the direction of the holler at first, that familiar stone against stone noise that had haunted my nights for weeks. But it was moving, getting closer, and underneath it, woven through it like a thread through fabric, I could hear something else. My name, spoken in that terrible backward voice. "Zephyr, Zephyr, Zephyr." I stood at the window with my rifle raised, watching the tree line, waiting for the shape to emerge. The moon was full again, bright enough to cast shadows, and I could see the holler's mouth clearly, that dark gap in the cedar and oak where the land dropped away into whatever depths the creature called home. And then I saw it. Not at the tree line, not emerging from the holler, in the yard, standing in the yard, less than 20 feet from the house, looking directly at me through the window. It had come without sound, without warning. One moment the yard was empty, and the next it was there, standing in the moonlight with its 3 amber gold eyes fixed on my face. I froze. My finger was on the trigger, but I couldn't pull it. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare back into those horrible eyes and feel my sanity straining at the edges. The creature tilted its head, that awful elongated snout swinging to one side, and opened its mouth. The teeth caught the moonlight, glistening with something wet, and that grinding voice emerged once more. But this time, it wasn't just my name. It was a message. I won't try to transcribe what it said. The sounds don't translate into human language, not really. But I understood the meaning. The way you understand the meaning of a nightmare, even when the details make no logical sense. It was telling me that it was patient, that it had been patient for a long, long time, that it had watched generations of humans come and go on this land, had taken what it needed when it needed it, and had always eventually gone back to sleep. But I had changed something. By watching it, by looking for it, by trying to understand it, I had made myself different from the others. I had made myself interesting, and it wanted to see what I would do. Then it was gone, not walking away, not retreating, just gone, between one blink and the next, like it had never been there at all. I stayed at the window until dawn, my rifle raised, my muscles cramping, my mind spinning in circles that led nowhere. When the sun finally came up and I knew I was safe, relatively safe until the next night, I put down the rifle and sank to the floor, and I cried. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I sat on the floor of that empty ranch house, and I cried like a child, because I finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't a problem I could solve. This wasn't a mystery I could unravel with research and determination and clever thinking. This was something ancient and alien and utterly beyond my comprehension, and it had decided to play with me. I was prey. I had always been prey. The only question now was how long the game would last before it decided to end me. I called Carol again that morning. She didn't answer. I left a message trying to keep my voice steady, telling her I loved her, telling her I was sorry for everything I'd put her through over the years. I didn't tell her about the creature. What would be the point? Then I called the sheriff's office and asked for the deputy who would come out to the ranch. When they connected me, I told him I was leaving, getting out, driving back to San Antonio and never coming near this place again. Smart choice, he said, and there was genuine relief in his voice. Real smart choice. Things like this, they pass. They always pass, but the people who try to fight them, who try to understand them, those people don't come back. I know, I said. I know that now. I packed my truck that afternoon. Not much to pack. I traveled light, always had. Just my duffel bag and my grandfather's rifle and the little silver cross around my neck. I took one last look at the ranch, at the ruined barn and the empty pastures and the dark mouth of the holler in the distance. And then I started driving. I made it about 3 miles before I had to stop. Because there, standing in the middle of the road in broad daylight, was the creature. My mind reeled. Everything I'd learned, everything Miguel had told me, everything the old stories suggested. The thing was supposed to be nocturnal. It hunted at night. It slept during the day. That was the one rule I'd thought I could count on. But here it was, under the full Texas sun, and it didn't seem bothered at all. It looked different in sunlight, smaller somehow, less threatening. But those 3 eyes still fixed on me with that terrible intelligence, and that grinding voice still echoed in my skull even though its mouth wasn't moving. Not yet, it seemed to say. You don't leave yet. I sat in my truck, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and understood that I'd been wrong about everything. It wasn't done with me. The game wasn't over. And if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to ever leave this place alive, I was going to have to figure out the rules. I sat in that truck for what felt like hours, though the clock on the dashboard told me it was only 17 minutes. The creature stood there in the middle of the road, unmoving, those 3 eyes watching me with a patience that transcended anything I understood about time or hunger or whatever motivated something like that. The engine was still running, the air conditioning blasting against my face, and I could feel sweat rolling down my spine despite the cold air. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel so hard. The creature tilted its head again, that awful sideways motion that made my stomach lurch, and I saw its mouth open slightly. Just enough to show the teeth. Just enough to remind me what was waiting if I tried to run. I thought about flooring it. Just slamming my foot on the gas and driving straight at it through it if I had to. The truck was heavy, built for ranch work, and I'd hit deer before without much damage. But this wasn't a deer. This wasn't anything that belonged in the natural world, and I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic, that metal and velocity wouldn't mean a thing against whatever stood in front of me. So I did the only thing I could do. I put the truck in reverse and backed up, slowly, carefully, keeping my eyes on the creature the entire time. It watched me go, that grinding sound rising and falling in my head like some kind of terrible laughter. And when I'd put about 100 yards between us, it simply stepped off the road and vanished into the scrub oak. I drove back to the ranch. What else was there to do? I couldn't leave. It had made that clear, and I couldn't stay forever, not without food, not without water, not without some kind of plan. The rational part of my brain, the part that had spent years working as an electrician, solving problems with logic and skill, started clicking through options. The creature had shown me something important just now. It wanted me here. It wanted to play this game. And that meant there were rules, boundaries, limits to what it would and wouldn't do. The electricity had hurt it before. Maybe not damaged it, but definitely surprised it, disturbed it enough to make it retreat. I started thinking about the barn, about the electrical panel in there, about the work I'd done upgrading the wiring last summer. Brennan had wanted the whole system modernized for the new milking equipment he never got around to buying. I'd run heavy gauge wire throughout the building, installed a new 200 amp service panel, the whole works. It was more power than a barn that size would ever need, but I'd done the job right because that's how my grandfather taught me. I got back to the ranch and parked as close to the house as I could. The sun was still up, still relatively high, and I knew I had maybe 5 hours before dark. 5 hours to come up with something that might save my life. The first thing I did was check the barn. The damage from 2 nights ago wasn't as bad as I'd remembered. One wall partially collapsed, some equipment scattered around, but the main structure was intact. More importantly, the electrical panel was intact. I flipped the breakers one by one, watching the lights come on in the different sections, listening to the hum of the circuits. Everything still worked. That was good. That was a start. The second thing I did was call Miguel. He answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice when he realized it was me. Zephyr, you still there? I can't leave, I said. It won't let me. A long pause, then quietly. Madre de Dios. I need you to tell me everything you know, everything your grandfather told you, everything the old-timers said, anything that might help me understand what I'm dealing with. Understanding won't help you, amigo. You can't fight something like that. You can't reason with it. Then tell me how people survived it before. Someone must have survived, or there wouldn't be stories. Another pause. I could hear him breathing, could hear the struggle in his silence. Finally, he spoke. My grandfather said there was a rancher, maybe 60, 70 years ago. His family had been on that land since before Texas was Texas. The thing in the holler came for his cattle first, then his dogs, then started watching his house at night. Just like you described, the man was going crazy, wanted to burn the whole holler down, salt the earth, whatever it took. What happened to him? His wife was from somewhere else. Mexico, I think. She knew things about the old ways, the things that lived in the dark places before people came. She told him that creatures like that, they're not animals, not spirits, not anything with a name we'd recognize. They're old. Older than the land, maybe. And they have their own kind of logic. What kind of logic? They want to be seen. They want to be acknowledged. But they don't want to be challenged. The rancher had been leaving offerings at the edge of the holler. Livestock, crops, whatever he could spare. The creature kept taking them, but it kept coming closer too. Because the offerings weren't respect. They were fear. And fear tastes good to something like that. It makes them hungry for more. I gripped the phone tighter. So what did the wife tell him to do? She said he had to stop being afraid. Not pretend not to be afraid. Actually stop. Face the thing with his heart steady, look it in its eyes, and refuse to give it what it wanted. Show it that he was not prey. That he was something else. Something it hadn't seen before. That's insane. How is that supposed to work? I don't know if it worked, amigo. I just know the rancher stayed on that land for another 20 years. Died in his bed. Natural causes. And his family never saw the creature again, not while he was alive. After he passed, they sold the place and moved to Austin. Wouldn't say why. I thought about what Miguel was telling me, about standing in front of that horror with a steady heart, refusing to be afraid. It sounded like the kind of mystical nonsense people told themselves to feel better about situations they couldn't control. But then I remembered the creature's message from last night. I had made myself interesting by watching it, by trying to understand it, by refusing to look away. Maybe that was the key. Maybe the rules of this game were simpler than I'd thought. The creature wanted me to run, to cower, to spend my last days or weeks in mounting terror until it finally decided to end me. That's what had happened to the cattle, to the deer, to every other creature that had stumbled into its territory over the centuries. Fear, flight, death. But what if I didn't run? What if I didn't cower? What if I faced it head on and showed it something it had never seen before? Not courage, not stupidity, but something else entirely. I thanked Miguel and hung up. Then I got to work. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of activity. I gathered every light in the ranch house, lamps, flashlights, work lights from the barn, and set them up around the property. I ran extension cords from every available outlet, creating a web of electric light that covered the yard, the porch, the path to the barn. I checked the batteries and everything, replaced the ones that were low, and tested each light until I was sure they would work when I needed them. Then I went to the barn and started on the real work. What I was planning was dangerous, insane, really. The kind of thing that would get your license revoked and your name in the newspaper. But I was past caring about codes and regulations. I was past caring about anything except surviving the night. I modified the electrical panel, bypassing the safety switches that would normally prevent someone from doing exactly what I was about to do. I ran heavy gauge wire from the main breaker to a switch I rigged near the barn's center, a switch I could throw with my foot if my hands were occupied. And I laid bare copper wire in a circle around where I intended to stand, a circle about 15 feet in diameter, connecting it all to the modified panel. If I threw that switch, anyone or anything touching that copper wire would take the full force of 200 amps at 240 volts, enough to arc weld steel, enough to stop a human heart instantly, enough, I hoped, to hurt something that had existed since before humans had a word for electricity. By the time I finished, the sun was setting. I stood in the barn doorway and watched the shadows lengthen across the pastures, watched the last light fade from the sky, and felt something strange settle over me. Not peace, exactly. Not acceptance. More like resignation mixed with determination, a clarity that came from knowing there were only two possible outcomes now, and both of them would happen before morning. I walked to the center of my copper circle and sat down on an overturned feed bucket. My grandfather's rifle lay across my knees. Not because I thought it would help, but because holding it made me feel connected to something. The generations of duskwalkers who had faced their own impossible situations and survived or hadn't, but had at least faced them standing up. The waiting was the worst part. I sat in the barn as full dark came, listening to the silence. No insects, no night birds, no wind through the cedar, just the hum of the electrical system I'd modified and the sound of my own breathing. An hour passed. Then 2. I started to wonder if maybe the creature had decided to leave me alone after all, if maybe my preparations had scared it off, if maybe... And then it was there. I don't know how to describe the way it appeared. One moment the barn doorway was empty, and the next moment it was filled with something that shouldn't exist. The creature stood at the entrance, blocking my only exit, and for the first time, I saw it completely. The lupine head was worse than I'd glimpsed before. The snout was too long, the proportions all wrong, and the 3 amber gold eyes were arranged in a triangle that made my brain hurt to look at. The third eye, the one in the center of its forehead, seemed to pulse with a light of its own, something that had nothing to do with reflected illumination. The mouth was open, those endless rows of teeth, glistening with saliva or something worse, and the tongue inside was forked like a snake's but moved with the dexterity of a human finger. Below the head, the body defied description. Shoulders too broad for any natural creature, covered in that patchy fur the color of drought-dead grass. The chest was exposed in places, the fur missing or torn away, and I could see the skin beneath. Not skin, really, but something that looked like burned leather, cracked and oozing. The rib cage was visible through gaps in the flesh, and inside it, organs pulsed with a faint bioluminescence, green and gold and colors I couldn't name. The arms hung nearly to the ground, ending in hands with too many fingers, each finger bent at extra joints that allowed them to flex in directions human digits couldn't. The claws at the end of those fingers were black and curved, and as the creature took a step forward, I could hear them clicking against the concrete floor. The legs were the worst. They bent backward at the knee, like a dog's hind legs, but the feet were almost human, 5 toes each, though the toes were elongated and tipped with the same black claws. Where the creature stepped, small wisps of smoke rose from the concrete, and I understood that whatever burned inside it was hot enough to scorch stone. It stood in the doorway, looking at me with those 3 terrible eyes, and the grinding sound filled my skull. My name whispered backward. Syllables that weren't syllables, meanings that weren't meanings, a language older than human thought, older than human existence, a language that had no right to be spoken in a barn in Texas Hill Country. I stood up from the feed bucket. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, in my fingertips, in the burned skin of my palms. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to flee, to abandon this stupid plan, and take my chances with the night. But I remembered what Miguel had said. Fear tastes good to something like that. It makes them hungry for more. So I didn't run. I looked at the creature, really looked at it, not flinching away, not averting my eyes, and I said, "I'm not afraid of you." It was a lie, the biggest lie I'd ever told. But I said it anyway, and I held my ground, and I watched those 3 eyes for any sign of reaction. The grinding sound changed, became something else, something that might have been surprise or amusement or hunger. The creature took another step into the barn, then another. It was moving slowly, almost cautiously, like it was testing me, waiting to see if my courage would break. I forced myself to stay still, to keep breathing, to keep my eyes fixed on those 3 amber lights that were getting closer with every passing second. "You've been here a long time," I said. My voice was shaking, but I kept talking. "Longer than the ranchers, longer than the settlers, longer than anyone. But I'm not like the others. I'm not going to run, and I'm not going to beg, and I'm not going to give you what you want." The creature was inside my copper circle now. Its feet were on the bare wire, and it didn't seem to notice or care. It was close enough that I could smell it, copper and rot and something else, something like ozone before a lightning strike. The heat coming off its body made my eyes water. "So here's how this is going to go," I continued. "You're going to let me leave tonight, right now, and you're going to go back to the holler and stay there, and I'm never going to come back to this place, and we're going to forget each other. That's the deal. Take it or leave it." For a long moment, nothing happened. The creature just stood there, less than 5 feet away from me, its breath hot on my face, its eyes boring into mine. The grinding sound had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world had ended. And then I felt it. The silver cross against my chest, the one the pastor had given me. It was warm, not hot, not burning, but warm in a way it hadn't been since I'd put it on. A gentle heat spreading outward from where it touched my skin like a hand on my shoulder, like someone standing beside me in the dark. The creature's 3rd eye, the one in the center of its forehead, twitched, focused on the spot where the cross hung beneath my shirt. And for just an instant, I saw something in those amber depths that might have been uncertainty. Then it moved. Faster than anything that size should be able to move, it lunged toward me, those clawed hands reaching for my throat, that terrible mouth opening wide too. I threw myself backward and stomped on the switch. The arc of electricity was blinding. Blue-white light filled the barn, and the sound was like a bomb going off, a crack of artificial thunder that deafened me instantly. The copper wire under the creature's feet became a conduit for 200 amps of raw power, and I saw just for an instant, before I had to close my eyes against the glare, what electricity does to something that isn't supposed to exist. It screamed. Not the grinding sound, not the whispered syllables. A scream, high and piercing and utterly inhuman, a sound that had no right to exist in any world. The barn filled with the smell of burning flesh, burning fur, burning something that defied chemical analysis. And through my closed eyelids, I could see the creature thrashing, convulsing, its body outlined in lightning. Then the power cut out. The breaker had tripped. Not the one I'd bypassed, but the main breaker feeding the barn. Something in the system had failed, overloaded by the sustained arc. The darkness that followed was absolute, broken only by the after images burned into my retinas. I didn't wait to see if the creature was dead. I didn't wait to see if it was moving. I ran. Straight through the gap, where the wall had collapsed 2 nights ago, out into the night air, across the yard toward my truck. Behind me I could hear sounds, no crashing, breaking, something moving through the wreckage of the barn, but I didn't look back. I yanked open the truck door, threw myself into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. Thank God, thank my grandfather, thank whatever power still looked out for people who did stupid, desperate things to survive. I slammed the truck into gear and drove. I didn't hit the road. I drove straight across the pasture, through the fence, over terrain that no truck was meant to handle. The vehicle bounced and lurched, and I heard something crack beneath the chassis. But I kept my foot on the gas. In the rear-view mirror, I could see the barn, or what was left of it. Flames were licking at the collapsed walls, and in the firelight I could see a shape moving, standing, looking in my direction. It was still alive. Hurt, maybe. Damaged, maybe. But alive. I drove faster. The next thing I remember clearly is the highway, the smooth asphalt beneath my tires, the distant lights of a truck stop ahead, the sound of my own breathing loud in the cab. I pulled into the parking lot, stopped the truck, and sat there shaking. I couldn't hold the steering wheel anymore. My hands were shaking too badly. And when I looked down at them, I understood why. The burns were bad. 2nd degree, maybe worse. When I'd thrown the switch, I hadn't been careful about where I was standing, and some of the arc must have caught my palms. The skin was blistered and raw, weeping clear fluid, and the pain, now that the adrenaline was fading, was excruciating. I stumbled into the truck stop and asked someone to call an ambulance. The next few hours are a blur of fluorescent lights and concerned faces, and questions I couldn't answer. The EMTs wanted to know what had happened. I told them I'd been trying to fix a generator and something went wrong. They seemed to accept that, or at least they didn't press. At the hospital in Fredericksburg, a doctor examined me and asked about the cardiac arrhythmia their monitors were picking up. An electrical shock, I told him. Yes, I knew it was serious. Yes, I would be more careful in the future. He wanted to admit me for observation, but I refused. Signed the papers, got my bandaged hands, and called a cab to take me back to the truck stop. My truck was still there, still running despite the damage I'd done to it. I drove the rest of the way to San Antonio with my burned palms wrapped in gauze, my ears ringing from the blast, my heart stuttering in my chest. I made it to the apartment Carol and I'd kept when we weren't at the ranch, the apartment she'd been staying in more and more often lately, and I let myself in and collapsed on the couch. She wasn't there. I don't know if I was relieved or disappointed. I slept for 14 hours. When I woke up, the first thing I did was call the Kendall County Sheriff's Office and tell them there had been a fire at the Brennan ranch. They already knew. Someone had reported the smoke in the early morning hours. The barn was destroyed. No one had been hurt, as far as they could tell. Mr. Brennan had been notified. The deputy who took my statement asked if I knew anything about how the fire started. Electrical fault, I said. Old wiring. I'd been meaning to have it looked at. He wrote that down and told me they'd be in touch if they had any more questions. They never did. I never went back to the ranch, never collected my tools, never finished out the summer, never saw Brennan or Miguel or any of the other hands again. I called Brennan a few days later to apologize for leaving so suddenly, and he said he understood. Said he was selling the place anyway, had been thinking about it for a while. The way he said it, I knew he knew something. Maybe not everything, but something. The fire, the barn, the stories the old-timers told about Devil's Notch. He knew enough to get out while he still could. Carol came home that first week. I tried to explain what had happened. Not everything, not the creature, but enough to help her understand why I was different. Why I couldn't sleep with the lights off anymore. Why I jumped at shadows and kept checking the locks and refused to go outside after dark. She listened. She tried to understand. But there are some things you can't share with someone else. Not really. Some experiences that create a wall between you and the rest of the world. A barrier that can't be crossed by love or patience or good intentions. One night, maybe 6 months after I came back, she asked me to tell her what really happened, said she could handle it, whatever it was. I opened my mouth to speak, and the grinding sound started in my head. Just my imagination, probably, just the memory of that voice saying my name. But I couldn't make words come out. I just sat there, mouth open, unable to bridge the distance between what I'd seen and any language she would understand. She never asked again. We stayed together for 18 months, trying to make it work. In the end, she said she didn't recognize me anymore. She was right. I didn't recognize myself. I took a job with an electrical company in San Antonio, residential work mostly, nothing complicated. Easy hours, nothing that kept me out past dark. My supervisor thought I was strange. But I was good at my job, and in this industry, that counts for a lot. I worked my way up to a crew leader position, then stepped down when I realized it meant too many early mornings and late evenings. Now I work on a schedule of my own devising. 8 to 4, nothing more. I live in a second-floor apartment with no balcony, no ground-level windows, nothing that makes me feel exposed. Every room has a car battery and jumper cables, ready to create a portable arc if I ever need one. Every light in the place is the brightest LED I could find. I go to church now, Sunday mornings, the Catholic church on Commerce Street. I hadn't set foot in a church since my grandmother died when I was 16, but something about what happened changed that. I'm not sure I believe in God, not really. But I believe in something on the other side of that equation now. Something old and dark and hungry. And if there's something on the dark side, maybe there's something on the light side too. Maybe. I also attend a support group. I found it online through a forum for people who've experienced things they can't explain. We meet every other Tuesday in the back room of a coffee shop near downtown. Nobody shares details, not really. We just sit together, people who've seen behind the curtain, people who know the world isn't what we were taught to believe. There's comfort in that, even without words. Sometimes I still hear the grinding sound. Late at night, when the city is quiet and I'm lying in bed, unable to sleep. A whisper at the edge of perception. My name, spoken backward, or syllables that don't form words or just the sensation of something paying attention. I don't know if it's real or just my mind playing tricks. I don't know if the creature is still out there watching, waiting, or if what I did in the barn hurt it badly enough that it's moved on to easier prey, to easier. I don't know much of anything really, except this. The burns on my palms never fully healed. The scars are there, permanent, pink and shiny against the calloused skin of a working man's hands. And sometimes, late at night, when the grinding sound starts up, when I feel that familiar chill run down my spine, those scars ache, a deep, throbbing ache, like something beneath the surface, responding to a frequency I can't hear. When that happens, I get up from bed and turn on every light in the apartment. I check the locks on the doors and windows. I make sure the batteries are charged and the jumper cables are within reach. And then I sit in the brightest room I can find and wait for dawn. Because that's the thing about surviving something like that. You don't really survive. Not completely. Part of you stays behind. In that barn, in that circle of copper wire, staring into 3 amber gold eyes and understanding for the first time what it really means to be prey. Part of you never leaves the holler. The rest of you does the best it can. I don't know what the creature was. I don't know where it came from or how old it was or what cosmic accident of evolution created something like that. I don't know if it's the only one of its kind or if there are others, hiding in the dark places of the world, watching and waiting for someone foolish enough to look for them. What I know is this: I'm alive. I'm free. I got out. And every day I wake up and see the sun come up, I'm grateful. Even if the nights are never quite dark enough. Even if I can never fully close my eyes. Even if some part of me is still listening for that grinding sound, still waiting for the moment when patience runs out and the game finally comes to an end. I'm still here, and that has to be enough.